and economic opportunity throughout Portland. So Portland Development Commission is the city's urban renewal and economic development agency. So on the one hand, for many, many, many decades, we've been the city's arm in facilitating a lot of the kind of catalytic redevelopment in the city. So the Pearl District, we were kind of point in negotiating the development agreement with White Street investors to kind of lay the foundation for a lot of that. South Waterfront is another one, as well as like a lot of neighborhood redevelopment. We're a major partner in the Mercado, so in our neighborhoods and in our central city, and we continue to do that work. Actually, for 4 years, I was a project manager for Central City, kind of real estate district planning, so I kind of have some background on that. So that's one piece of the work that we do, and I would say in the past 5 to 7 years or so, we put more emphasis on job creation, so creating more economic opportunity. And there's kind of two ways that we do that. One is what we call micro-enterprise, small business, focusing on local serving businesses, really prioritizing underserved populations. That's what we call our community economic development. And then the group that I work with is economic development, and then we work with traded sector industries. So that's an economic development professional lingo for those industries and companies that bring money into the region. So they're selling their products and services nationally or internationally. That's tech, that's Nike, athletic and outdoor, that's those sorts of companies when I say traded sector. So actually, a lot of folks that get a lot of confusion about this, and since this is a talk about urban manufacturing, I'll give you some examples. So when we talk about these two things, I'll take two, Keegan, Megan, and Grove Maid. They actually used to be, is anyone familiar with those companies, by the way? At all? Grove Maid, yeah. So they actually used to be in the same building, then Grove kept growing and growing and growing, and they moved out. And so Keegan Megan, a letterpress, they do like these really high artisan kind of business cards. They serve a lot of local creatives, but mainly their clients are local serving. Really high quality product, but mainly their clientele is in Portland. So we kind of consider them, sort of small business. We don't consider them traded sector so much. But Grove, they send their product all over the world, and they continue to grow, and so they bring money into the region. And then another way is like, food, for example. There's, really well-known food cart. She kind of moved from micro-enterprise to small business. She got a brick-and-mortar location. She started growing, but she still serves a local clientele for the most part. And then we have Raft Syrups, a local startup, and they do botanical syrups, but their goal is to sell nationwide, so that's sort of a traded sector company. So hopefully that makes some sense. And so the right-hand side is mostly what I'm going to talk about today, because my job is to work with local startups across all industries, whether it be food or tech or whatnot. Okay, so I'm actually going to kind of go to a little bit of a higher level today to give you a little bit of insight in terms of at PDC today how we kind of approach economic development from this sort of traded sector approach, and why that's unique, how we do this uniquely for Portland. So here are kind of some approaches I'm going to talk through today. So the thing about Portland is we know many things, that we're very green, that we've got great neighborhoods. It's not a big surprise for this room that we have a long legacy of really progressive urban planning that is kind of unprecedented throughout the country. I have a background in urban planning, and it's sort of lauded as that city. But we've got a really strong DIY culture. People here like to make things, and kind of when we talk about Portland's strengths and building on those, I sort of we look at those sort of soft things and hard things. So. These are some of the Portland values that we think are important to build on, and it's kind of interesting. Past 2 weeks I've had 2 trips back to the East Coast, one to New York and one to Philly for work, and it's kind of interesting to see how these values play out or don't play out in cities like New York, and how it's sort of how it's sometimes a problem for them or not a problem for them, but at the end of the day, these are Portland values: collaboration, abundance. This idea that there's enough for everyone. We can all collaborate together, and then we're better for that. And we're fiercely, we're fierce supporters of the local businesses. We're going to go to Stumptown as opposed to Starbucks. That's just kind of how we work. Innovation, we like to kind of make our own new things. We always want to innovate, and sustainability has long been a value for us. But this kind of plays out in our industries. So green building and technology is an emerging or a high growth industry cluster for us. Advanced manufacturing, we have a lot of large legacy manufacturers, precision cast parts, Vigor Industrial, a lot of them metalworking. They've been here for quite some time, and they're a major industry cluster for us. Athletic and outdoor, so everyone's familiar with Nike, Adidas America, Columbia, Keen, and a lot of other athletic and outdoor products that we have in our region. And software, which is probably one of our fastest growing clusters here in Portland. So those are our strengths, and so we think we should just build on those, right? Not try to invent something new. And I think the thing about us as well is that we really believe that we should pay most of our attention, if not 99% of it, on growing our own companies. That's where the job creation is going to come from. So, we initiated a number of initiatives like the Portland Seed Fund, which is an early stage accelerator and an investment vehicle for early stage startups. And then we really believe that, that as a city, we have some leverage to help some of our early stage companies to grow and to adopt their technology. So I don't know if anyone has the Globe Sherpa app, the ticketing app. Are you guys familiar with that a little bit? No one has the ticketing app? Guys, it's 2014! We were the first city to actually launch a TriMet ticketing app. So you can buy your tickets with an app. You should check it out.
Well, okay.
Okay. Lucid Energy, this is a technology to use in water pipes. Actually, it's a way to generate energy within water pipes, and we were the first kind of adopter of that technology for this local company. So, what I'm trying to say is that as a city, one pain point that a lot of startups have is they can't get that first customer, and that's where we can play a role, is actually saying, okay, you need a first customer, we want you to grow, we want to help you out, we'll help facilitate that, and we'll take you on. Will be one of your clients. And in fact, I've got a colleague that is working on a city's first adopter program to create a marketplace and exchange between city bureaus and local startups that have innovation. So if there's a local startup that has an innovation in water, could be something related to green building, they have a way to connect to those bureaus to kind of pitch that product. So they're working on building out that application. And the other thing about growing your own is that, we have a really great ecosystem to support our companies. This is for startups, so again, sort of these traded sector, high growth startups. But equally, and maybe Nathan can speak to this, is that, we also have a really great ecosystem for our small business, micro enterprise businesses, like Mercy Corps is really great. And so in Portland, we really pride ourselves in supporting our small businesses, and there's an entire ecosystem to speak to that. And we even have a startup that's all about kind of facilitating community. So this is a tech startup, Switchboard. Again, something you should check out. Maybe I'm throwing some new stuff at you might want to check out. And they basically have a community bulletin platform where you can ask and offer. And it seems very simple, right? Like, okay, great, ask and offer, isn't that Craigslist? But it's actually kind of a private community, and you can see follow through. So it's just very, very well designed for folks out there who are really big into design, really great design. And they have communities across the country, but they also have a startup switchboard in Portland. And then there's a meat collective switchboard for people who are like, who are growing meat, how do you say that have meat to offer, and those that want to buy meat. So there's all sorts of communities that they have, and it's pretty Portland that we have our own kind of Portland startups one. So here's kind of the interesting thing, I think, for this audience is that, let's see, we did an export strategy with Brookings, I think this was 2 or 3 years ago, and looked at how can we as a region increase our exports. So if you think big picture, where are the growing markets? They're actually not in the United States. They're in South America, certainly China. So a lot of the growing markets are not in the United States. And we wanted to think about how can we help grow our companies by increasing their markets, and how can we work globally. But how do we do that in a Portland way? We're Portland, we have a lot of kind of values about staying in Portland. How do we do that? Interestingly enough, when we did the study, we found that green building was one of our big advantages when we looked on a global scale. So a lot of cities, not just in the nation, but globally, kind of looked at Portland and they were like, whoa, like how do you do this? How do you do this district planning thing? How do you build your environment to make it so livable, so desirable, and kind of all those things about Portland that you know about. And we sort of just take it as how we are, but a lot of cities all over the world are sort of really amazed at this. So I don't know, has anyone heard about the We Build Green Cities campaign? Ever seen the site? Okay, great, okay. So we've got a number of engineering and architecture firms that really have that expertise, right? ZGF is a really good example, and that have really been developing that expertise over decades. So we basically develop trade partnerships with different cities in emerging markets. So we have one with Suzhou in China, Medellin in Colombia, and then we work a lot in Japan. So we've actually gotten companies jobs in Japan, like quite large, significant jobs. And a lot of this is kind of interesting, right, is that these countries are sort of, in like Japan, they don't even allow street cafes, right? So they're kind of like amazed, how do you do that? And so part of this is really taking that expertise and exporting it. And then by developing these partnerships, we then build upon our other industries. So in Japan, we did a trade mission with our athletic and outdoor products, our athletic and outdoor companies, as well as some of our makers, like Grove actually went to that as well. So that's something that I think a lot of people don't have on their radar about PDC and what we do. And so the other piece that we think is really important is inclusion and equity. And I think we think about it in the sense that we thought about green building and sustainability maybe decades and decades ago, is that as we build out our city, we want to think green, we want to think sustainable. And I would say right now, that's really great, but actually right now we want to start thinking about how do we bring people to the table who haven't been at the table before? How do we nurture leaders of color, women leaders, people who have not traditionally been leading, particularly in our innovation economy? So when I say innovation economy, that's more or less those four industries I showed you: software, athletic, outdoor, advanced manufacturing, and green tech and green technology. So we launched an effort earlier this year called Include, Innovate, Invest Portland, and really kind of felt that it was time to actually embrace that conversation, have that conversation, acknowledge that. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with the tech startup scene at all in Portland. There's actually a really vibrant tech startup scene here. If you go to any of those meetups, you're going to see maybe 90% white males, which white males are great people. I mean, they're fantastic, but you just don't see any diversity, right? So that's an issue. That's actually an issue for a lot of reasons. So tech is one of the fastest growing sectors that we have. On a nationwide basis, there's an estimate that we'll have 1.4 million new tech jobs by 2020. 70% of those will go unfilled. So when you look at who gets hired by tech companies and the fact that they're not tapping into an entire workforce that is a big part of our population, that's a problem. Also, diversity brings innovation. There's many, many, many studies that have said that. And the other thing is that Portland, this is actually a problem that we have, is that we're kind of seen as a very white city. And kind of our split from the city boundaries is 70-30. So that's 70% white, non-Hispanic, and 30% people of color. But in our Portland public schools, and I'm actually not talking about Washington County, just in Portland, almost half of our kids are kids of color. So the future of Portland is going to look very different. And then if we don't have mentors now to sort of show that example for our kids as they as they start thinking about careers, we see that as a big problem. So this is an effort that we've started. We've started doing some things around this. We're actually working with the Pratt Center in New York, alongside Indianapolis, New York, and San Jose to do a study around how we can create a work plan that more solidly addresses this. That's where I was last week. PDC, I've given you a little idea of what we do, and again, what I do is one piece of a much bigger picture. But I think for us, how we see our role is there's a lot of roles that we can play and a lot of power that we can leverage to sort of, embrace these values and embrace what is best for Portland and what the stakeholders see as best for Portland. So we're certainly a connector and a convener. We're a support and a resource. And we really kind of are the stewards of the city's economic sustainability. So industry thinks, 5 years ahead, 10 years ahead. We're thinking decades ahead, and that's why inclusion is a really big, important part of what we do. So here's an example of a project that I just did that actually that I work on that connects a lot of different things. So I run an annual startup competition called the Startup PDX Challenge. I negotiate with a property owner on free space, build out that space. Actually, the New Market Theater, just a block from here, is where their space is, to award free rent to 6 startups for 1 year. So basically, we do a competition, startups submit applications, they get free rent for 1 year, they get a grant, no equity taken, which is a big deal for them, and then a whole suite of professional services and memberships. So we had 6 companies that won. And then we had 5 merit winners this year. And every year what we do is we think about what's a different topic that we want to tackle, what's a gap that the ecosystem isn't filling right now. And this year it was around inclusion, and so we explicitly kind of said that, and then found a number of leaders, people of color and women who are leading companies, and chose them for this competition. And also, this is a very Portland thing, is these were all of our partners on board for this. So this kind of shows that spirit of collaboration and kind of what we can bring to the table when we work with a lot of different partners. A lot of them provided in kind. Some of them really kind of work with us and helping to find pipeline for the startup competition, such as Hispanic Pros and Urban League and Professionals, and that's sort of an example. So I actually made this really quick, and so you can ask me questions, but you can also ask me questions about stuff not related to that at all, because I know this is a room full of architects, because that's really kind of a body of work that you may not be as familiar with. Yes?
I've got a question about workforce training.
Yeah.
It seems to come up over and over. I was working last year on a strategy for the East Bay on advanced manufacturing and critically short production workers. The point that Bayer was repatriating a $700 million investment to Germany as opposed to Bayer. And when we looked closer, what we found was that there were some perverse incentives in the workforce training industry to focus on the least skilled people, because the training institutions would get the most bucks that way, as opposed to those that were closest to employment. Have you run across this issue up here?
You mean
where the money
the skills
goes in the workforce
mismatch that we
training?
always talk about?
Yeah.
Or
Of what sector you're aiming to produce as a workforce?
So just one caveat is that we don't do workforce training at PDC.
Okay.
That is the Work Systems Inc., who is our partner, and
You
they
would-
do the workforce training.
I guess the question is, do you influence that, how that money's
Right,
spent?
yeah, absolutely. So we do funnel some funds to them, and we partner with them on several initiatives. I think the issue for us is that there's kind of some monies, and I'm not sure if this is addressing your question or not, is that there's a lot of money, and this is particularly true in tech, is that there's money to sort of train folks and give them that education, but it's also and that's the pipeline, but we're actually kind of, at PDC, we're how do we give people jobs today? How do we sort of get them into those jobs right now? Or how do we, there's on-the-job training programs, but there's still I think when you look at the pipeline about getting people in jobs, there's still kind of some gaps there.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if that was your
That
question.
didn't quite answer it. So
Okay.
what I was finding was that there was a relatively large population, if you will, of, let's call it Cal State East Bay PSU style grads with an English major or someone working as baristas, underemployed. Okay. And then there was a huge population of high school students who had never gone to college. And that the workforce money tended to be focused on those unemployable people, and that there was very little money for taking the college English major and repurposing them for ready production in biotech. Because the system was biased towards dealing with the people that really lacked the most skills, as opposed to closing the gap on those who were closest. And I know you guys don't do workforce training, but the question is, where is the money going in the system in terms of getting workers closest for the least amount of money? Have you dealt with this issue? Because it's a factor of production.
Yeah, I have to say I'm not quite sure I've totally dealt with what you're talking about. I mean, there's a little bit of a difference in what you're talking about. So, like when I think about college-educated grads, I think that's what you had just alluded to.
Yeah.
Like I think about that sort of a bit more. We have, like, for example, an athletic and outdoor young professionals group, and so that's actually getting people who are interested in changing, making a career path change, or they may be actually recent college grads, and they may be an English major, trying to get them connections into that industry. So that's a little bit of what we do on that side, but that's very different than that skills piece. And I think that there's an element there, if you're talking about manufacturing, there's an element of actually making manufacturing jobs interesting to people, and that's kind of another topic.
So what the South is doing, particularly around the auto places, is they're going back and getting those college workers and putting them into blue-collar apprenticeship programs. And I just wonder, is any of that going on around here?
Not to my knowledge. Yeah. Yes? But maybe, I don't know. Yeah.
As a part of your startup PDX challenge, you offer professional services that can come along with that package. Is architecture or build out any part of that?
Yeah, so one thing to think about with these startups, these are folks who are 2 to 3 founders. By the end of the year, they may grow to like 5 people with some contractors. And those companies are not going to get to the level of needing architecture for maybe another 5 years. If they're really fast, maybe 3 or 4. In fact, we were kind of debating, should we put them in contact with brokers? I mean, so I think a lot of them, they're not really going to be there for quite some time. Startups think they're in survival mode, like they're just thinking like the next year ahead. And in fact, a lot of our tech startups in Portland, we always have this problem is like, they're like, okay, we need space and we need it in 2 months. And they need 40,000 square feet of space, which in Portland sometimes is kind of hard to find if it's the kind of space they want. And so they think on these much shorter timelines. They don't understand that you need quite a bit of, it's kind of good to know about that sector actually, is that they don't think far enough ahead, and it's kind of hard to communicate that to them sometimes. Yeah. Yeah.
There were times in its history when the PTC played a much greater role in physical redevelopment.
I would say we still do. It's just not my job.
Right.
Yeah.
But my understanding was that there's been a little bit of a retreat from that, or is that not the case?
I don't know to say that there's a retreat from it. I just think that, so during the recession, nationally, the policy agenda was jobs. So that's when we did our economic development strategy. And certainly, I think we were behind in the job creation agenda. And so we did a lot of work to try to catch up to that. Right now, I've got some colleagues who are doing 2 major development agreements, which we have not done development agreements for quite some time. So certainly, we still continue to play a role there. I just think that it looks very different than it did in the past. Yeah. Yes?
Do you guys do any tracking or mapping of the various kinds of startups and entrepreneurs that sort of come through your organization as far as success rates and how many of them continue to grow versus how many of them start and kind of fall off?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So coming through our organization, we do have a internal software that we use to track the companies that we interface with, but that's probably a very small fraction compared to the entire community. That's a really good question because that data is really hard. It's really hard to get. There's like business license data, but that doesn't always tell a whole lot about the nature of the company. But that's something actually that we're struggling with and hoping that we can figure out a better system for.
If that was possible, if you were able to get that, how might that help or affect what you guys do? What would that allow you to do?
In terms of like being able to track the success rate?
Knowing what kinds of businesses are succeeding, what are the sort of makeup of those businesses, where are those businesses located within the city? I don't know, I was curious if that information could be helpful in helping to propagate this sort of economic momentum that you're trying to build in the city.
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of stuff that we would love to know, right? I think the thing to realize is one reason we put like startups in a separate bucket of small business is that startups, maybe 3 out of 10 will actually keep going, very high failure rate. So there's a lot of reasons why early stage startups fail. So to kind of track that is kind of a different thing than small businesses. I think we're very interested in who is starting companies and what's the demographic makeup. Certainly I think it would be kind of, and we have data sources to kind of look at what kinds of industries and types of businesses by neighborhood. We've got data for that. Those are some things, but yeah, there's a lot of details in the data that's kind of hard to discern. Yeah. Anything else?
Other questions?
Yeah.
Small. So like all through the symposium, I guess we're calling this, or is it a conference? I forget. But we've been hearing about sort of profits, not-for-profits, actively sort of partnering up with startups and micro-enterprise and all that. Do you see sort of public entities like the PDC as playing a permanent role in this, or do you see eventually the private sector doing enough that you won't need public involvement on that level?
That's a really good question. I have to say that for any project we do, if we know that the private sector can eventually take it and run with it and we don't need to put our money in it, that's great. That's a success story. In fact, the Portland Seed Fund, that was the first publicly funded early stage accelerator, and probably when they raise their next fund, we're not going to need to put any money in that. And the reason for that is if that happens, that's great. That means we can put our money towards a new gap we're seeing that we need to address. But I'm not sure on your question because you said on this topic, so I wasn't sure what you meant. Do you mean in micro enterprise? Do you mean in?
Yeah, I mean, I guess do you see public sort of aid in micro enterprise or startups? Let's just say startups.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see that as sort of a leftover of economic recession? We've come out of a tough time and we need sort of public support, or do you see the public sector playing an actively more, like you were saying, we look 30 years, decades ahead.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think the public sector can play a more sort of far-sighted strategy compared to private sector?
Yes, and I do think we'll always play a role. It's just going to be kind of nuanced how we do it. If we feel like the ecosystem is taking care of certain things, there's a lot of talk about, there's a lot of support for tech startups and not so much for some product startups. So we're kind of looking at that. So we're always kind of looking at where are other organizations not able to fill the gap, not because they're not doing a good job at what else they're doing, but is there a way for us to instigate, on inclusion, how can we start instigating that conversation? Because we're seeing a problem here. So how can we kind of start instigating that? And maybe in a couple decades, we don't need to worry about it anymore. I don't know. Does that help?
Yep.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.